Hi guys, it's Chelsea from Little Mountain Ranch. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to talk all things squash, all the way from the point at which you put the seed in the ground to harvest and then on to storage. I have already done, as you can see behind me here, my squash harvest, and I did film it for you, but sadly my microphone glitched out at some point during that video recording and I am not able to show you the entire harvest. However, I will give you a peek at it. It was an absolutely beautiful day. We harvested 237 thereabouts, give or take a few squash from our squash patch, which is by far our best harvest ever. I have been giving away squash like crazy because that is way more squash than we could ever use unless we ate squash every single day for just about a year. I absolutely love growing squash. Squash is one of my favorite vegetables to grow, and it's also one of my favorite vegetables to eat. All right, when it comes to squash, there are a couple of things that will be helpful for you to know to be able to have a really good squash harvest, even if you live in a short growing season like we do. Okay, let's start at the very beginning as far as planting your squash. I start my squash 4 weeks before my last frost date, so that usually puts me around the first week of May or so. I'll start my squash. I start them in large enough containers that I'm not going to need to pot them up. Squash plants are incredibly vigorous and grow really quickly, and they don't really like to be to have their roots disrupted that much. So I try to plant them in a container that's about this big and this deep because I know that their root system will grow to fill that, and then I can just move that straight into the garden. I tend to use paper pots, which works really well because those can just be planted right into the ground without disturbing the roots of the plants, and then they just biodegrade throughout the summer. So that's the way I do it. When you put them in the garden, make sure that there is absolutely zero risk of frost. They are super sensitive to frost, and if you are going to plant them a little bit early, do make sure that they have some sort of frost protection via a frost blanket, even a big sheet or something like that, because frost can completely wipe out your squash patch, even if it isn't a very hard frost. That has happened to me more than once, and I've learned my lesson now. I'll just wait even an extra week if there's any risk of frost. When it comes time to actually planting your squash, plant your squash in mounds. The reason that this is really a good thing for squash is because they don't like to have waterlogged roots. And if you have them in a mound, usually because you're fluffing up the soil, there's pretty good drainage then, and that can just help the roots stay moist without being waterlogged. When you are going to amend your soil, I find that using well-rotted manure compost is the best thing for squash. If you're going to get into testing pH and things like that, squash tend to prefer between 6.0 and 6.5 pH level. I never do anything like that. I just add my compost and it seems to work just fine. When it comes to watering your squash, they do like to stay consistently moist. They don't like to dry out. You've probably seen, if you've ever grown squash before, that in the heat of the day, squash leaves will really limp out, and they will so even more if you don't keep them nicely watered. I tend to do at least 1.5 to 2 inches of water per week, so that's a really nice deep watering once a week, twice a week if it's really hot. Hi, Citrus. Oh, he still smells a little skunky. Oh, he's doing his job by keeping the skunks out of the chicken coop, but I wish he could be a little bit more savvy as far as being sprayed, buddy. Around mid-August, prior to frost, any risk of frost, I will go, oftentimes I'll do this. I didn't do this year because I had such a large patch and it just wasn't really practical, but you can go cut off the ends of your vines. Anywhere where you can see fruit developing that you know is not going to develop in time, just cut those off, and then the plant will put the energy it has into maturing the fruit that you have on the vine. This is the same as I've shown you as far as topping tomato plants, pulling flowers off of pepper plants and tomatoes, immature fruit and that sort of thing, so that the plant can put the energy that it has left into maturing the fruit that you have. For us, right between the mid of August, around the 15th of August, and the second week of September, I'm paying really close attention to frosts. If we're getting kind of between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius, we will experience frost around those temperatures. It's usually okay to leave the actual squash themselves out in the field. If we get anything colder than that, down to around 0, I want to get the squash off the field, which is why I picked all of my squash, because we are going to see 0 degrees by Thursday this week. I have left my squash out on the vine for too long before, and what I find if it hits around 0 degrees is that you'll get discolored spots on the skin, and those spots will end up getting soft and eventually rotting. So it's a really good idea to get your squash out of the field before it gets that cold. Now, when it comes to harvesting your squash, this is the fun part of it. It's kind of like a treasure hunt because you'll have all these big vines and you'll peel them back, and underneath you'll see these absolutely gorgeous squash. I like to harvest mine either prior to the frost. That's sort of the determining factor for me. But if I can leave things out and we're not going to get hard frost, I like to wait until, let's see if I have an example here. This is a good example. Until the stem of the squash, maple, until the stem of the squash is dried out, as you can see this one is. Once it's dry, it creates basically maple. Once the stem of the squash dries out, like this one you can see here, it's still green, but it's perfectly dry. Then it protects any bacteria, molds, or anything from getting down into the squash. One of the things that's really important when you pick your squash, and I'll see if I have one here that I messed up on. I do. You really want to try to keep your stem on your squash, like this one over here. It just gives a little bit of added protection rather than breaking it right down to the base of your squash. So just try to be careful with that. It's not a huge issue. Just make sure that you use the ones that you've broken off first. Once your stem is dry, the way that you can check for sure that your squash is cured is by sticking your thumbnail into the rind. And if it does not actually dent it, then you know that your squash is cured. Okay, I'm just going to show you how you can actually ripen your squash off the vine. This is a just about ripened butternut squash. As you can see, it's nice and yellow. There's not a lot of green striping. This one over here is not ripe yet. Can you see how it has green on it still? So each squash is different, so you will want to go look online to just see what a mature squash of whatever variety is you're growing looks like. And you want it to look like that before you put it into storage. What I do with these squash, and this is something I have to do just about every year, is I put them in a sunny window, on the kitchen table, anywhere where they're going to get a little bit of light, and let them ripen that way. This can take up to a month, so don't worry if it's not happening right away. One of the things that you can do to extend the storageability of your squash is to wash your squash before they go into storage, paying particular attention to around the base here and around the stem of your squash here. I use vinegar and water usually. I've also used essential oils like melaleuca, tea tree oil, anything that's going to kill off mold spores. Give them a really good wash down before they go into storage. And to store them, you can just put them in a box layered with a little bit of space between each one. Any kind of airflow is always good whenever it comes to storage. And you can put those in a closet as long as it's relatively cool, underneath a bed in a spare room. If you have the advantage of having a cold room, that's optimum. I like to keep mine at under 10 degrees Celsius. Seems to work really well for storage, and really dry. You don't want to put squash like this into, say, a root cellar, because the humidity level is too high and they will end up rotting. I like a sweet, meaty squash for the most part, and storageability, of course, is top of mind for me. So I'm going to run you through all of the squash that I grew this year and talk a little bit about what I like about each kind. I will put a comprehensive list over on my website along with links to all the places that I bought these seeds. So this one, like I just showed you, this is a butternut squash. I grew well over 100 of these squash, which makes me really happy. I do find that these squash tend to need to ripen inside. They don't usually reach maturity here. They are a longer squash, but this one in particular seems to do okay, and it is just about ripe. So probably a couple of weeks in a window and it'll be just fine. I did grow quite a few of these little Jack Be Little squash. They're super adorable. And what I've been doing is cooking these up for my youngest, who's 6, because they're just a perfect little size. The flavor's okay. They're a little bit watery, but more than anything, they're cute and they make a really nice autumn decoration. Spaghetti squash. I love spaghetti squash. This is the squash that will store the longest in storage, at least in my experience. I've had them last for up to a year. They do start sprouting on the inside and the flavor's not great, but they are edible. I love Hubbard squash, but the big giant Hubbard squash don't have time to reach maturity here, grow as big as they can or anything like that. So I found these baby blue Hubbard squash. Isn't that adorable? And I love the flavor of these. So this is a really good option for a shorter season if you like the Hubbard squashes. So I grew quite a few of those, I think about 10 of them. And then we have these giant monster squash. This is called a Geet Okasamen. It is one of the oldest known cultivars. Apparently the seeds were found in a cave, I think, in Minnesota somewhere. I'm not entirely sure, from over 800 years ago. We cooked one of these squashes up a couple of weeks ago and it was really, really delicious. And for a family of our size, this is a good size squash because we can actually eat this in one sitting. For most people, this is probably 3 or 4 meals, but they do store really well and they taste really good. They aren't quite as meaty as, say, a buttercup squash or a butternut squash. The flavor of this I kind of found was a bit mixed between a spaghetti squash, but with the consistency of a butternut squash, not quite as dense as the butternut squash and not quite as sweet, but really good. And most of my kids liked this. I started growing the Cinderella pumpkin about, I think 3 years ago now. And the seeds were actually originally sent to me by a woman named Rhonda, who I met through my channel. And ever since then, I grow them every year because they are absolutely delicious, delicious. And one thing that I like about these pumpkins is they're not ginormous and they are sweet, they can really well, and they make a really good pie. These ones store for about like 3 months, maybe 6 months in an optimum environment, but I try to have them all used up by 3 months. And then one of my favorite squashes in all the world is the Burgess Buttercup squash. This is a very similar flavor to the butternut squash, but more dry. We just made some squash soup with this last night, which I will be sharing with you that recipe coming up because it's really, really delicious and super easy to make. But the only downside of these guys is they don't store quite as well. And it has to do with all of the ridges that you can see in the bottom of the squash. These are usually the first ones to go in my storage, so they'll also be the first ones that we use. This one is the only new to me squash that I grew this year, but it is definitely my favorite as far as appearance. Look at all of these gnarly little bumps all over them. Some people refer to them as warts, which just makes it seem a little bit less appetizing. So I don't refer to them as warts. But this one is called a peanut pumpkin, or and I'll see if I can pronounce this, galudicine, I think, which is a gorgeous pumpkin. And someone told me on Instagram the other day that they had heard that all of these ridges and these bumps that you can see are actually the sugars of the pumpkin coming out. And what was really neat is when we were harvesting all of these, my goats came, as they always do, and they were checking everything out. And when they found these pumpkins, they started nibbling all of these little ridges off the pumpkins. They weren't interested in any of the other squash, but they did like these little ridges, which leads me to believe that it's because they were really sweet. I have heard excellent things about these pumpkins as far as being one of the sweetest pumpkins, but I will let you know when it comes to doing some preserving with these, I'll bring you along with us for that. And we'll do a taste test and see what is the sweetest of all of these squash. And that is it. I didn't actually grow a lot of different varieties this year. I'm getting to the point in my gardening where I really stick to what I know works here. It's taken quite a few years. I think we're on our 6th garden, maybe our 5th garden here in this area. And I do have things kind of narrowed down and I know what works. So I don't waste my time with a ton of experimentation. Although each year, like with these beautiful pumpkins here, I do like to experiment with at least 1 or 2 things. Oh, I forgot one more pumpkin. We grew a Dill's Atlantic Giant pumpkin, which I try to grow every year for the kids and just see how large of a pumpkin we can actually grow. And Kate and I could just about not lift this pumpkin out of the garden. It was absolutely huge. And I have it on the wagon beside us here because we couldn't even carry it up to the house. We haven't weighed this pumpkin yet, but I will weigh it before this video goes out and I'll put the weight down here. But it is enormous and my kids are super excited about carving this one up. All right, that is it for me today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. If you have any further questions for me about growing squash or anything to do with squash, let me know down in the comment section below and I'll do my best to answer those for you. I hope you have a fantastic day. I'll see you again next time. Bye.